This is the second of my videos delving into the new Ocarina of Time game. In my previous video I looked at whether we could expect a more imaginative reinvention of the core title, or something that colours broadly within the lines of what's gone before. Today though, I want to delve into the vexed question of who might actually be developing this title. I've explored this before and the field remains probably very open, but I do have a conclusion which I think makes sense and which I haven't yet seen being tipped elsewhere. All that said, let's take a step back and take a critical look at all the likely candidates. First of all, my presuppositions. Ocarina of Time is incredibly important to Nintendo. Yes, all Nintendo games are important to Nintendo to some degree, especially all Zelda games, but this is one of their most celebrated titles of all time and frequently tops lists of the best games ever. I don't think it's impossible that they seek outside help in developing the game. Indeed, they've done this before with Ocarina of Time when they did Ocarina of Time 3D and gave the contract to Grezzo. But come what may, I think we can expect a very significant focus from the core dev team, and I've previously outlined why I think Daiki Iwamoto will be, if not directing the project, then certainly in charge of shepherding it. Iwamoto directed Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, Wind Waker HD, and Skyward Sword HD, and has also been a senior figure on a number of other Zelda projects. While Fujibayashi is leading the core game development line, Iwamoto seems to be shepherding everything else. He is also responsible for working with the Monolith Soft developers and was interviewed with them, and of course he worked on both the games developed with Tantalus Media and was a key figure going back to the original Ocarina of Time itself, including working on the game cinematics, which are clearly going to be a focus of the new title. However, if by some chance Iwamoto weren't to be leading the development of this project, there is one more candidate, perhaps a surprising candidate, but nevertheless someone who I think would do an amazing job. What if this game's director is none other than Eiji Aonuma himself? It might be surprising given that it's very rare for Nintendo's top people once they reach a certain level of seniority to go back into directing, but it's not unprecedented for Aonuma, who directed Zelda Twilight Princess HD in 2016, long after he had handed off the reins of the major titles to Fujibayashi. He is one of the few people with the moral authority to hack around with such a luminous game as Ocarina, should he wish, and given that he is potentially approaching retirement, he's in his 60s, there may also be some logic in letting his successor, quite possibly Iwamoto, carry the day-to-day bureaucratic stuff that comes with leading the Zelda property while he gets into the weeds on a game once again. Indeed, there are references in a recent Monolith Soft interview to suggest that Iwamoto is managing most of the Zelda's day-to-day content, and in many respects, you could imagine Aonuma wanting to sign off with a major game like Ocarina of Time as a capstone to a long career dedicated to Zelda. I don't think it's flat out likely, but it does strike me as plausible. There are other people at Nintendo who might lead projects, of course. Indeed, we've seen a willingness from the company to hire from across the different groups for key projects, such as top-down Zelda's Shiro Mori going over to direct Super Mario Bros. Wonder, although he did have a history with 2D Mario previously, and in the case of Donkey Kong Bonanza, they even went for an outside hire. But the great tradition in EPD3 would be to promote from within, suggesting a greater role for one of the Heartland Zelda developers, probably one of the senior developers behind The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. And I've identified people like Yuya Sato and Yohei Fujino as potential candidates before to lead a new project, possibly with the intention of eventually taking over a mainline game, having gained experience of leading a slightly smaller scale project. At any rate, Ocarina of Time is a historic opportunity for Nintendo to experiment with game cinematics and 4K animation with the security that they have a limited scope to the game and a rock-solid core concept. So I think they will want as far as possible to have their core developers not just leading the development, but learning from the game development itself in order to feed this wisdom into future titles, notably the next big Zelda game, which is probably ramping up into full production about now. All the same, a game like Ocarina of Time is going to require a significant number of staff, especially to produce the many and varied graphical assets required of this world. This is an ambitious project that has likely been quite a few years in development, and so it's time to take a look with fresh eyes and no prejudgments at the potential candidates to helm this remake. First of all, EPD themselves. I've already highlighted Tomodachi Life and Donkey Kong Bonanza as examples of groups that were formed within Nintendo to shepherd specific projects, even though there wasn't really anything more than a skeleton crew in Tomodachi's case, and no substantial standing group in the case of Donkey Kong, who regularly worked on either Tomodachi or Donkey Kong in the mid-2010s. If you want to build a strong internal development group who can then pivot to supporting the mammoth task of the next open-air Zelda, a title that frankly I remain skeptical will ship this decade, then an internal group makes the most sense logistically. It's also just the case that the kinds of people especially required by such a game, artists, animators, and so on, would be especially useful utility players, and it's likely that Nintendo could already staff such a team by drawing from the staff of titles like Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, although I suspect that they will want people who will stick with the Zelda property for the longer term. Nintendo has been hiring pretty consistently, and if we estimate the start date of this project as being between 2020 and 2022, with the intention of it originally probably being that it would be a launch window title for the new machine once it was definite that Tears of the Kingdom would come to the existing Switch rather than the successor, well, if that's the case, then it's likely that a huge amount of hiring over this period was actually with Ocarina of Time at least partly in mind. In particular, Tears of the Kingdom had a huge number of people working on the game, and while I haven't exhaustively compared all the credits, a sampling of the production art and character design credits suggests that these people generally haven't been on a game since Tears of the Kingdom, while a number of the landscape modelers did go over to Mario Kart World. Now, I haven't looked at every single one of these, and if we think about the prospect of the next mainline Zelda, it may make sense for the characters to be designed first and the landscape a little bit later. But it also feels consistent with what you might expect of a relatively small world like Ocarina's that is nevertheless populated with a number of truly iconic characters who they want to render in exquisite detail for the new generation. Of course, where many of these people have past credits, it's often not just on Nintendo internal projects like Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, and Tomodachi Life, but these Xenoblade titles, usually up to around Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, but with the occasional credit still for Xenoblade Chronicles 3 and even Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition. Clearly, this indicates a heavy involvement from Monolith Soft, and this would be consistent with Iwamoto's involvement as well. In the Monolith Soft website interview with Iwamoto, and albeit I'm using Google Translate, he identifies himself as the manager of the Zelda property and a non-executive director at Monolith Soft, which tracks. Note that Koizumi is also the general manager of Nintendo, while Takahashi, the notional head, has a more executive designation, which is probably where Aonuma is right now, even though, of course, Aonuma isn't actually on the board of directors for Nintendo. There are a few other interesting aspects of this interview as well. Fujita of Monolith Soft notes that whereas usually on Monolith Soft games the team moves on once the game is complete, with Breath of the Wild they stayed on the game to commit to debugging. One element of the interview that comes through clearly is the difference in working styles between the Monolith Soft and Zelda teams, with the Monolith Soft developers preferring to have discrete job roles and responsibilities for which they have long-term accountability, and the Zelda team preferring to have a rapid pace of prototyping and blasting ideas, with people pitching in irrespective of their usual background responsibilities. While a decade and a half of collaboration has doubtless acclimatized Monolith Soft to Nintendo's working methods, this sounds like a far better disposition for something that requires the reverence of tackling a title such as Ocarina, and the fact that the team was sticking around through the debugging of both the previous Wild games makes clear that there is a pretty dedicated Zelda team now that has been built, and as far as we can tell, there is one consistent Monolith Soft group which is dedicated to Zelda. Iwamoto also states quite plainly, "We would be very happy to see a team that says something like, 'We'll handle everything from here on Monolith Soft's end,' suggesting that Monolith Soft could indeed take on a game. And of course, the recent history of Nintendo Splinter developers is full of people whose first game was a new version of older titles like the NES Famicom Detective Club Duology, Metroid Return of Samus, or indeed Grezzo's original work on Ocarina of Time 3D. The final note is, we want Monolith Soft to take on more and more core roles as a strong partner in creating Zelda from the ground up. Although, of course, this is just consistent with the progressive integration of the teams from Skyward Sword through to Tears of the Kingdom, so it doesn't necessarily mean that they'd be working on a completely new game in their own right. We also need to consider whether an Ocarina remake is the best deployment of such a team. For one thing, a successful Ocarina remake would likely open up the potential of a similar treatment for, at least, the other Hero of Time games, Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess. That could potentially occupy a team well into the next decade and split their attention from their more obvious tasks, the development of the next major new Zelda title. Also, though, Nintendo probably don't just want remakes and spin offs between now and the next mainline title, especially if that game doesn't release until the 2030s. They have the top-down games as an alternative source of new content, but one option would be for Monolith Soft to work on something akin to Triforce Heroes, which serves as a companion game to the main series with a different approach to the gameplay, potentially a more multiplayer-focused title. If we assume that the next Zelda isn't due until 2030 or beyond, and it could well be longer, then we might expect a Grezzo remake in about 2027, possibly a Hero of Time Warriors game in 2029, but they're going to need something else in there as well. It would definitely make sense for a good number of the Zelda art team to be seconded to Ocarina, but I'm not sure having them as the primary developers makes the most sense, and for the same reason Nintendo may feel that having their EPD3 team manage another version of an older title isn't the best utilization of their strengths either. For now then, while there is a lot to recommend either or both of Monolith Soft or EPD3 as the developers of Ocarina of Time, I think we need to start to think a bit broader afield and start to look at outside developers. The first candidate to discuss would be the team that handled Ocarina of Time before, Grezzo. Grezzo has become a very reliable partner studio for Nintendo, and although the bulk of their games are relatively modest graphically, they have some experience already with 4K graphics in the form of their independent dragon racing game for mobile, Jet Dragon. Although they have had multiple groups before, the Link's Awakening staff appeared to be largely pivoting to work on Miitopia in 2021 before doing Echoes of Wisdom for 2024, and so although the team has been expanding significantly and there's clearly a deep trust there between Nintendo and the Zelda team and Grezzo, it does open the question of whether 2 years is sufficient time for what appears to be a very extensive project on Ocarina, even with the support from EPD3, Monolith Soft and Nintendo Pictures. Also, Grezzo has been committed to the top-down games of late, and that's a line that Nintendo will also need to continue, so it might be a Pyrrhic victory for their overall development effort if they end up gaining an Ocarina game but losing the opportunity to do something new in the top-down space. The last of the people in the Zelda team's immediate orbit would be Tantalus Media. Based in Australia and with multiple studios, the team worked on the HD versions of Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, and while the team is always having multiple projects on the go, those tend to be on the smaller side. Despite this, there is a small cluster of core staff who have no other credits at Tantalus other than the Zelda game, suggesting that there may well be a set of Link people with Nintendo that are hubs of a potentially wider Zelda group at Tantalus. Luigi's Mansion 2 HD was also produced by Tantalus, of course, but largely by different people from the Zelda team. All that said, Tantalus would require a huge amount of scaling up to be able to handle a project like this, and while it's completely plausible they could be around as a support team, and while I do think Nintendo and indeed the Zelda team will turn to them again for a game, to me the most obvious use of their skills after Luigi's Mansion 2 HD would be A Link Between Worlds, which is currently stuck on the 3DS. Now, if the plan is to do a redo of A Link to the Past, then A Link Between Worlds might be overkill at this point, but it might be one to make and stick in the vault for a rainy day, which we know Nintendo does from time to time. Of course, there's also Wind Waker, but that already had an HD version after all. All things considered, if the game is primarily within EPD3, then drawing on Monolith Soft and Tantalus for support feels plausible, but otherwise I think we need to look further afield. And this is where it gets tricky. Nintendo has other studios, but this is a huge title for them to trust, and a new developer is likely to need some considerable learning curve. That didn't stop them with the original Ocarina going to Grezzo, but there they had a personal relationship for a very long time with founder Koichi Ishii of the Mana games, and who, among other things, created the Chocobo for Final Fantasy. Credentials like that are rare indeed. There is also the question of whether we should be looking at a Western or a Japanese developer. Generally speaking, when Nintendo has games whose primary market is Western, they like to try to involve Western developers. That's not always, but has frequently been the case, with Metroid, Donkey Kong Advance Wars, Luigi's Mansion, and Mario Strikers all being at various times entrusted to Western developers to a greater or lesser extent. And while I can't think of a reputable example of Zelda being entrusted to non-Japanese developers, and Wand of Gamelon stands out as a non-reputable example, it's still something that is kind of possible, especially with an American movie on the cards and with the Western gaming space having tended more towards these kinds of realistic narrative experiences in the main, giving them perhaps a bit more experience in what Nintendo might want to achieve with Ocarina. Therefore, it might make some sense to contract a Western studio. It's possible, though seems unlikely, that this would be an existing Nintendo studio. Nintendo Software Technology is likely too small, Retro Studios too busy with Metroid Prime 4, and Next Level Games has been expanding but also has Luigi's Mansion on the cards, which surely has to be their major priority. Velan Studios are working on Star Fox, and so we start to be in a situation of looking for a completely new studio. Frankly, this leaves the field incredibly open, and I don't pretend to have any particular insight into teams that might work with Nintendo in the West, because there are just so many people. One interesting candidate worth particularly attending to is Ember Lab, who have announced a second Kena game in the works for this year. A smaller and animation-focused team, they came to attention through a Majora's Mask short, which frankly does look quite similar in a broad sense to what the new Ocarina appears to be. It feels incredibly unlikely that a small team could handle both Ocarina and a second full game, albeit one that's been on the ball for 5 years, but what I will say is that a hookup of some sort between Ember Lab and Nintendo does have some kind of obvious benefits for both parties. For Ember, it gives them experience of working with the best in the business on Zelda-style properties, which should help them on Kena, while for Nintendo, the team has a solid reputation for graphics, and it would be a good way of building contacts with the Californian animation industry. It would even be a good deal for Sony, on whose console the second Kena game is due to be published, as even if that game gets delayed out to 2026 and into the next year, the game will still get far more attention by being in the slipstream of Ocarina. Irrespective of whether Ember Lab themselves are involved, and the safe money is they won't be, it does strike me that Ocarina's very name gives Nintendo a terrific opportunity at assembling a great group of devs around a project, and there's no shortage of Western talent. Of course, the recent era of mass developer layoffs probably postdates the project being booted up, but there's still a lot of people who I'm sure that could be hired to a big project like this. Of course, Kena relied on assist studios as well, including one very familiar name, Virtuos, the Singaporean studio who has been involved in a wide number of games, including Metroid Prime 4 Beyond for Nintendo. Singapore is an interesting place for Nintendo because it's also the base of the newly minted Nintendo Studios Singapore, although for most of the recent years they were Bandai Namco Singapore and appeared to have a significant proportion of their relatively small group dedicated to Tomodachi life. Again, if there were an internal project, you could see some configuration of Monolith Soft, Tantalus, and the Singapore studio pinching in to make it work. But if the Singapore team were trusted with carrying more of the load, then it might be that they would want to have the involvement of someone like Virtuous as a support studio once again. Or perhaps Nintendo would want to stay close to home, in which case I think we get to what I believe to be the most likely single example of a studio who might develop Ocarina of Time, which is one of the sub-teams of Koei Tecmo. Koei Tecmo, of course, have already co-developed Pocopi this year, are likely involved in Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, and so this would still be a big deal for them to have yet another Switch 2 launch window title. However, there are several obvious advantages with Koei Tecmo. Firstly, they're in rude health, with the company proclaiming at their recent financials that their aim in the next decade is to become one of the top 10 companies in the world for electronic entertainment. Moreover, their newly minted AAA studios, designed to handle big IP, has already produced Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, and it would make sense to imagine that the Hyrule Warriors series will continue with a future title adapting Ocarina into something of a Warriors game. After all, if the next Hyrule Warriors game follows the release intervals of the last few and hits around 2030, it's unlikely the next Zelda would be very long in the tooth by then, and so Ocarina might be a more promising basis for a new game. In this case, wouldn't it simply make more sense for the AAA studio to develop Ocarina as well, and then cannibalize their own assets into a Warriors game as part of ameliorating the costs of production? In particular, during 2025, Koei Tecmo's map of the kind of games each studio under their watch was going to be involved with broke down with AAA studios' main titles being listed, note the plural by the way, titles not title, as simply under development. No specific titles listed. Now, yes, it's a new team, but also the thing is, most third-party collaborators are actually quite happy to announce things in advance, while Koei Tecmo have no reservations about pushing their own brands and pre-announcing them as well. So the fact that the studio's titles in 2025, prior admittedly to the Age of Imprisonment reveal, were just under development could indicate a significant Nintendo-facing portion of their large new studio. Koei Tecmo have enough studios that there are plenty of people that could work on Zelda. Amiga Force appeared to handle Procopio after all, but the AAA team also talks about the fusion of knowledge from multiple brands, suggesting that they're particularly interested in being outward-facing. They want AAA quality global titles, of which Ocarina would certainly be one, and they want new interest and excitement for the studio, which certainly would be garnered by launching a big new game into the Zelda 40th anniversary window and right before a major film. Well, with the best will in the world, a second Hyrule Warriors of the Wild title is far less impressive as a calling card than working on the major Ocarina of Time revamp. So in terms of Koei Tecmo's apparent fierce ambitions, this does make a lot of sense. And they have that deep and long connection with the Zelda team built up over many years already. You can easily see Koei Tecmo having the strength in depth to not just turn around in relatively quick succession Ocarina, but also to bring Majora and Twilight Princess to market, and this would allow Nintendo to rest on them to tie into potential future movies. This is clearly the kind of prestige Koei Tecmo want, so why wouldn't they harry Nintendo for the contract if they had even the vaguest sense that a new Ocarina was on the cards? And of course they knew it was on the cards, because everybody knew it was on the cards for reasons I've been covering on this channel for years. For this reason, the more I think about it, the more Koei Tecmo, and probably specifically AAA games, feels like the really strong candidate here. While it would be a side project and potentially a distraction for Monolith Soft, Grezzo and others, it would be a positive launchpad for Koei Tecmo at this point, and I think Nintendo would be quite relieved to have a major studio working on it, meaning that they could kind of relax and focus on the next Zelda game. And of course, I still don't think it necessarily rules out there being a separate Monolith Soft developed side title based off the main Zelda series coming in the next year or so. In forecasting terms, I often find trying to predict studio assignment one of the hardest things, as there are so many possibilities and the odds of any individual group has to be so low. The way I construct my forecasts doesn't especially lend itself to these kind of predictions as well. Still, in terms of the spread of likelihoods for the developers, I'd say 90% Iwamoto receives a senior credit on Ocarina, 50% Ocarina is developed by an external team or company that Nintendo has worked with previously, 30% Ocarina is developed internally, including with Monolith Soft, 30% Koei Tecmo are involved in some way with Ocarina, 30% Eiji Aonuma is directing Ocarina of Time, and 10% Grezzo are involved with Ocarina of Time in some way. For more of my coverage on Ocarina though, do check out my recent video on the extent to which the new game will depart or colour within the lines of the original title, and of course there is early ad-free and exclusive content to be seen on Patreon. Thanks as ever for watching, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.